Hello and welcome to the Arise interview, where we take time to reflect on the big stories from the news and on the fortunes and affairs of the world in an hour of conversation with commentators, analysts and thought leaders. I'm Charles Aniegolo. Coming up in the next 60 minutes, just under 7 years ago, heavily armed Boko Haram Islamist militants kidnapped 276 schoolgirls in the remote Nigerian town of Chibok. 57 of them managed to jump out of moving trucks into which they had been forced and escaped. The rest were taken to a destination and a fate unknown until another 50 were released. Well, now a new book by Wall Street Journal reporters Joe Parkinson and Andrew Hinshaw, who were based in Africa at the time, presents the story of the ordeal of the Chibok girls in gripping detail. We'll speak to Andrew Hinshaw, one of the authors of Bring Back Our Girls, the Untold Story of the global search for Nigeria's missing schoolgirls, in a moment. And later, you may know that Nigeria and Jamaica marked 50 years of diplomatic relations in 2020, and to commemorate the occasion, the first direct flight from Lagos to Montego Bay took off in December last year, with both the Nigerian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Geoffrey Onyeama, and the Jamaican High Commissioner to Nigeria, Esmond Reid, on board, as well as a host of Nigerian and Jamaican officials and business operators. It was supposed to be the start of a new historic trade relationship between Nigeria and Jamaica. So how have things progressed since then? We'll speak to the Jamaican High Commissioner, Esmond Reid, coming up. Now, kidnappings and the abduction of school children appears to be getting worse in Nigeria. The international community first came to know about this problem in 2014 with the mass kidnapping of the Chibok schoolgirls. As hundreds of young women were preparing for their graduation exams in the evening of April the 14th, 2014, dozens of gunmen stormed into their boarding school and made off with nearly 300 girls, taking them to the remote forest hideout used by the Islamist insurgent group known as Boko Haram. Dozens managed to escape, but many others were trapped and still are to this day. The news went viral on Twitter, and the hashtag #BringBackOurGirls attracted some of the world's most recognizable people, including Pope Francis, Kim Kardashian, and Michelle Obama. Well, now a new book titled Bring Back Our Girls, The Astonishing Rescue of Nigeria's Missing Schoolgirls by Joe Parkinson and Andrew Hinshaw is out, and it's getting lots of attention in Europe and around the world. Well, let's speak now to one of the authors of the book, the Wall Street Journal reporter Andrew Hinshaw, who joins me from Poland. Andrew, thank you very much indeed for joining us. You are in Poland, I hope.
That's right. Yeah, I moved here a bit ago. Thanks, Charles. Thanks for having me.
Right. I've heard anecdotally that you walked into a Nigerian minister's office, you and Joe, and the things he said was what made you decide to write this book. You think you might tell us about that?
Sure. I mean, I had been covering in Nigeria and covering this kidnapping from the first day after it happened. And we covered it and we wrote about it. And, within hours of this kidnapping happening, we were talking to relatives on the phone. And, it was one of these stories that faded in and out over years. And, covering Boko Haram, you always would return to this sort of momentous case. There was a moment in 2017 where we had this interview with a cabinet minister that you mentioned. And at that time, Boko Haram was back on the upswing, and there had been all these attacks, and the trajectory of the war was not good. And we asked him for his analysis of why this was, and he sort of with a chuckle said, because we gave them millions of euros for the Chibok girls. And that lit a spark in my mind to think, what did it take actually to do this? Millions of us in Nigeria and the UK and the US, around the world, the most famous people, the most ordinary people, demanded that this just thing happen, that these young women be returned. And what was, for me, the starting point was to find out, what did it take? And why did it take 3 years to free only 103 of these young women?
Well, I can assure you that's a question a lot of Nigerians are asking to this day, because, I mean, it remains an extraordinary mystery. It's like one of those UFO things you read about, and, people disappearing and you don't quite know what happened to them. But now, Andrew, it's been about 7 years since that Chibok story broke around the world. Tell us about your book and what it's actually about.
We set off to understand the basic question: why did this take 3 years? When a French family was kidnapped in Cameroon, it took 6 weeks to resolve. 6 weeks, how come it took 3 years to free a group of young women that seemingly every celebrity on earth had championed? Why? The US sent drones. What did that amount to? Countries around the world, China promised satellite footage. Did it ever come? Israel promised intelligence. Canada sent special forces. Nigeria obviously dedicated a lot of effort to this issue. Why did it take 3 years? As we embarked on that question, we found that we couldn't really answer that question without talking about another one, which is, how did these young women survive for 3 years? These were ordinary high school students one day. In a way, extraordinary, because in that part of the country, less than 4% of women in Borno State finish high school education. So already they were extraordinary in that sense. And then they find themselves in these remarkable circumstances. How do you survive? How do you hold on for 3 years while the world, with all its military might and intelligence, fails to find and free you?
I have to say, just scanning the front and back of the book, I mean, it just sounds so riveting. The book, of course, just listening to you describe it, is both about the horrendous conditions they had to live through, the enormous privations, and obviously the psychological pressure. But there's also, as you said, a story of survival and resilience. And I expect that combination makes your book well worth reading.
Mm. Well, I'm glad to hear you think so. Yes, the suffering that these students endured was extraordinary. At a point, they were eating ants to survive. They were drinking water that was muddy, eating grass. This was extreme suffering. I would also say that, as is common in war, out of that extreme suffering comes extreme heroism. And these women didn't just suffer, they rebelled. They fought back. They refused their captors for 3 years. We followed one of the women, Naomi Adamu, who kept 3 diaries tied to her for 3 years. She kept her school uniform for 3 years. She kept her cell phone. Boko Haram, in the first hour of the kidnapping, said, hand over your Nokias. She kept her phone on her for 3 years. That's astonishing. And she's not the only one. A lot of these young women, they were victims, but they were also survivors, and they were people who rebelled against the idea that they should change their religion or their identity by force.
And I mean, was there the threat of death or beatings, punishments, torture, that sort of thing hanging over them?
When several tried to escape early on, that's exactly what they were told. If you try again, this is graphic, so for your viewers, but several were told, we're going to cut off your necks. There was repeated threats. There were constant threats. And obviously, we're talking about 16, 17, 18-year-old children here. And I found the fact that in those circumstances, some found the ability to withstand that, to rebel, to keep their identity about them. I found that extraordinary. And, at least as interesting as this fact that still sticks in my mind that, Nigeria with all its resources, America with all its military might, Europe, all these parts of the world failed to find these girls. That to me still, I find that deeply troubling, that 200 people in a time when every, phone call and everything is online, that 200 people could just vanish into a forest.
And it is those elements that I believe makes your book so interesting, that detail and that key word that you mentioned, heroism. I wonder if those girls spoke about being witnesses to some of the atrocities that Boko Haram commit? I mean, because that in itself is also psychologically traumatic.
That's absolutely right. You have the trauma. What I can say is that some of them took lengths to document what happened to them. They were, some of these students were keeping diaries. Some kept diaries that were lost. In that sense, they've tried to, reconstitute from memory. At one point, a small group of about 4 or 5, they had a cell phone on them with no reception, and they were able to take pictures. They took pictures of themselves because they said, one day we're going to get free, and we want to show the world this is how we were treated. This is what happened to us. That was important. I think that's important for, and that, people all over the world, when they are abducted, we spoke to a lot of counselors and psychologists about this. One form of kind of coping with that can be to keep a record of the injustice that happened to you. Nelson Mandela wrote his autobiography from a prison cell, on scraps of paper that he buried in a vegetable garden. I think these young women were doing a similar thing. They were keeping a record of the wrongs that had been done to them so that they could bring it to the world.
Fascinating story, Andrew. Stay with us. We want to talk with you some more. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with Andrew Hinshaw, co-author of the new book, Bring Back Our Girls, about the 2014 mass abduction of the Chibok girls. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Enyegolu. It was an event, or perhaps I should say the event of 2014, the mass abduction of 276 Chibok girls. It set alight not just frenzied international news coverage. Arise News was, of course, the first international team to get to Chibok, and yours truly, the reporter who covered the story. It also inspired a global race to free the girls using the Twitter hashtag #BringBackOurGirls. At the same time, it led to a shift in Boko Haram tactics. Suddenly, the world began to see female suicide bombers in Nigeria as gender violence became a means of furthering the global brand of the militants. It's all there in a new book, Bring Back Our Girls, the Untold Story of the Global Search for Nigeria's Missing Schoolgirls, co-authored by Wall Street Journal reporters Joe Parkinson and Andrew Hinshaw, who were based in Africa at the time. The ordeal of the Chibok girls is central to the book, and they present the story in gripping detail through lengthy interviews conducted by the authors with 20 of those girls. And one of the authors of the book, Andrew Hinshaw, Drew, as he likes to be called, is still with me from Poland. Thank you very much indeed, Drew, for staying with us. And I was talking about you interviewing all those girls. Just tell us more about how you gathered the information and authenticated it, the information that you included in your book, who you talked to, etc., to be able to arrive at the real story of what happened to the girls.
Right. Approaching something like this, you don't know, where do you begin? There's a 3-year gap. And I could say that the story of what happened here is not singular. You have, hundreds of women who went missing. Different people had different experiences, different perspectives on the same events. And my approach here was just sort of to listen and what, of these 3 years, what were the points that mattered to you? What were, the things that mattered to you? There was a lot that I hadn't fully appreciated. There was, tragically an airstrike in 2016 that killed a number of the young women. This was reported, it was in the news, but it didn't catch fire. I think about why that was. And I think August 2016, It was in Sahara Reporters. It was reported, but for some reason we just, as a society, didn't even register it fully. That was the kind of event that I think a number of the different survivors sort of brought up and just said, "Hey, this is what, these are some of the things that we remember about these 3 years."
Well, absolutely, and of course, we certainly remember that since that time in 2014, kidnappings have got worse and worse in Nigeria, with many other criminal groups borrowing a leaf from Boko Haram's page and abducting school children. But I understand, Drew, that Boko Haram did not originally set out to kidnap the Chibok girls. I mean, that's included in your book. Tell us about that.
The group, and this is written in several of the diaries, and I think it was talked about at the time, but we sort of somehow didn't process it. The group set out to take a brick maker. There's a brick making, an engine block at the school where they could produce. I think reasonably you could deduce there was a shortage of housing in Sambisa Forest, and there was an argument after they gathered up everybody in the courtyard. There was an argument about what to do with them. You'll remember this. This was shortly after Buniyadi. This was really tragic stuff. This was, this school that had been burned down. This was the environment and the context that this took place in, and it was a split-second decision to put these young women in a truck. And of course, nobody could have known. But I think you'll agree. You covered it at the time. This was something that really changed the conflict. It changed, the international dimension of the conflict. I think it changed the seriousness with which it was taken in Abuja by the previous Goodluck Jonathan administration. It changed Boko Haram, and it continues to change this security situation there. There were negotiations for years, and all of this just sprung from a last-minute decision taken after midnight on April 15, 2014.
And I think that's what makes it even more interesting. I mean, because just that decision basically transformed the world. It's like a spark that ignites into a roaring sort of forest fire. And the lesson of Chibok, to not just to security, to people like you, me, and a lot of other people, there was also a lesson to bandits and insurgents that you can kidnap the weakest and most vulnerable link in society, which is children. And I think your colleague mentioned that, Joe. And you can frighten and intimidate the rest of society and even the international community into giving you a global platform and into paying whatever money you ask for.
Yeah, I think it's really... obviously Boko Haram didn't invent the business of kidnapping and ransoming, but the fact that this has become a business model, and you see these kidnappings in Kaduna and elsewhere that are being resolved in 2-3 days, that's wonderful in some sense, because it means people aren't, being kept for 3 years like the Chibok girls were. In another sense, it's concerning because it shows you that this has become a business, a routine, a mechanized way of raising funds.
Absolutely. And another aspect to the Chibok debacle that you talked about in your book is the hashtag Bring Back Our Girls, which became prominent around the world, including, of course, the White House. But how much did that help or hinder a proper understanding of what was really going on in Nigeria?
What I think we can say for sure is that this hashtag started a race to free the Chibok girls. Nigeria was kind of working on it. The Goodluck Jonathan administration was just when that hashtag in April 30th, May 1st, May 2nd, right in there, the administration started to consider negotiations. But just as that was starting, it ricocheted in the speed of a tweet all over the U.S. You had Hillary Clinton, Michelle Obama, obviously, Angelina Jolie, the Pope. I mean, you name it. All these kind of American and European figures. Prime Minister David Cameron. It was just one person after the next, and that I think started a global race. You had You had intelligence coming from drones being fed into the CIA station in Abuja. You had an Australian friend of the Archbishop of Canterbury who flew to Abuja, got to meet with Goodluck Jonathan many times and say, hey, I can find the girls. You had, political figures in Nigeria offering their help. You had, Francois Hollande in the middle of this. Goodluck Jonathan has a crisis on his hands, and Francois Hollande invites him to Paris. It's remarkable. I mean, like, what he should have. Well, let me not make a judgment, but you could certainly see a case for being in Nigeria, and he goes all the way to Paris to meet with, all these defense and military and diplomatic officials from the US, France, and the UK. Everybody tried to help, and I think it's for sure that some of these actors undermined each other. You had some people trying negotiation, some people trying military force, people, working at cross purposes.
It's amazing listening to you talk, because I was actually on that trip with Goodluck Jonathan with another correspondent of ours, Carl Bostic. We both traveled from the UK to Paris to cover that visit of Goodluck Jonathan. It's interesting, though, that 7 years after Chibok, the insurgency is still raging. There are more kidnappings in spite of the internationalization of that conflict, and there isn't a coordinated strategy yet to end the kidnappings of school children. I mean, is it fair to say that, at least from the Nigerian side of things, no lessons have been learned from the Chibok experience? We've got about 30 seconds.
Sure. I mean, I think it's very hard to solve this ransom business. It's a pattern. Nigeria is not alone. Other countries have experienced this. Mali had a similar problem. The U.S. has its own problem protecting schools. They're soft targets. I don't know that there's an easy solution. I can only say that the number of Nigerians missing registered with the Red Cross is 23,992, and it strikes me as a tremendous problem that.
Okay, Andrew, I want to thank you very much indeed. Andrew Hinshaw is co-author of the new book, Bring Back Our Girls, the Untold Story of the Global Search for Nigeria's Missing Schoolgirls. Thank you very much indeed, Andrew. You're watching The Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead, including as Nigeria and Jamaica try to establish closer trade ties after 50 years of diplomatic relations. We speak to the Jamaican High Commissioner in Nigeria. Stay with us.